Today's topic is writer Alan Moore, the co-creator of V for Vendetta and Watchmen, as well as the author of Batman: The Killing Joke. Welcome to another episode of The Real Heroes. Remember to subscribe to the feed and publish reviews on YouTube, Spotify, Google, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen. Remember to download the episodes, and if you want to support the show, you can find The Real Heroes on Patreon. My guest today is Dr. Liam Burke of Swinburne University. I am your host, Michael Lay, and this is the Real Heroes podcast. So, who exactly is Alan Moore?
Alan Moore was part of the British invasion of the 1980s, where British comic book creators like Neil Gaiman, subsequently Grant Morrison, and of course Moore himself, made a name for themselves initially with UK-based publications like 2000 AD, which was this anthology sci-fi comics still running today, probably most famous for Judge Dredd. So Moore would have created characters like Halo Jones for 2000 AD. And at the time, it was Karen Berger, who was working for DC Comics, saw this British talent and sought to bring them over to the US to work on US books. A lot of them went to work for the new DC imprint Vertigo, which was, mature, mainly kind of horror and kind of gothic stories. So Neil Gaiman's Sandman, for instance. But a lot of these creators were put to work on kind of iconic American characters. I suppose what's interesting about these the British creators is they didn't have a reverence for superheroes. So there isn't the same tradition of superheroes in Britain. It's very much an American character type. So when these creators tended to engage with superheroes, it was with a more revisionist or critical lens, sometimes subversive, sometimes parodic. And so when they came to the American comic book industry, which was by and large superheroes, at least the mainstream was, you got character creators like Grant Morrison doing kind of inventive things with characters like Animal Man, or you had Alan Moore take on characters like Swamp Thing, who are kind of a slightly ridiculous concepts, but giving them a degree of sort of nuance or self-awareness that previously hadn't been seen. And that kind of self-aware lens continues then, of course, into Watchmen. I mean, today we're used to writers and artists from all over the world working on American comic books. But the 1980s really represented the first time in a sustained way that a major US publisher, in this case DC Comics, looked beyond New York and kind of the greater New York area to recruit writers and artists. And they recruited these British creators. And so you had these British creators who in many cases had never been to America or never lived in America, writing these very American characters in these very American settings. So it's noteworthy that Moore, unlike some of his equivalents, never made the move to America. He was at one for attending San Diego Comic Con. And so he writes these very American stories in these kind of urban US milieus from Northampton, which he has never left. So it's and I think that gives him probably a bit of critical distance. And allows that work to be more playful and more subversive.
Moore reflected on his childhood in the 2000 television program Comic Tales with Alan Moore.
Northampton is a town that is at the economic, geographic and historic dead centre of England. And to a degree, this town is my territory.
I think my ambition from an early age was to be a superhero. I remember that I got my mum to make me a costume and I got the mask. And I went and hid in a tree and waited till some of my friends walked past, and then I jumped down wearing the mask and the Star-Spangled costume, and they knew who I was. They said, "Oh, hello, Alan." And I said, "I am not Alan Mortals, I'm a defender of justice and decency." But I could never understand that. I mean, because all Superman has to do is to take off his glasses and comb his hair and nobody recognises him. But that was my first ambition. When I realised that I probably couldn't be a superhero because of this mask problem, I thought that I'd probably prefer to be somebody who wrote or drew superheroes.
Alan Moore was expelled from school and disavowed by surrounding colleges when he was caught selling LSD.
And so Watchmen, as a miniseries with Dave Gibbons, begins in 1986. It runs for 12 issues. Originally, Moore wanted to take the Charlton Comics characters like the Blue Beetle and the Question, which had been subsumed by DC Comics. Ultimately, some internal decision was made that he would not have access to those characters, so he created analogs for those characters. So the Question becomes Rorschach, Blue Beetle becomes Night Owl, and so on. And it's probably for the better, because he was given a blank slate to reimagine the American superhero through a very critical or self-aware lens. So these are superheroes who fail to be altruistic, characters like the comedian who are sadistic, characters like Dr. Manhattan who are above the problems of everyday civilians, characters with issues of with the parents, with impotency, with all sorts of sort of concerns that clearly or previously were rarely evident in a superhero comic. And what he does with that comic, and Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns, which was published roughly around the same time, is he repositions not just the American comic industry, but the superhero genre in particular. And we enter into a kind of a revisionist stage where the tenets, the conventions of the genre are retaught, from the altruistic hero to the dual identities to the costumes they wear. I mean, it's not for nothing that the superheroes in Watchmen wear purples and browns rather than the bright yellows, blues, and reds of heroes like Captain America, Superman, Wonder Woman, and Spider-Man. It suggests that by using these secondary colors, that these are characters who don't fall into the simple black and white morality of previous superheroes. And there were lots of imitators to Moore's approach, with varying degrees of success. And to the point that in the early 90s, you entered like a dark age in American comic books, maybe as typified by characters like Spawn and others, with creators like Todd McFarlane, like Mark Millar, who were not necessarily bad creators, but just sought to emulate the success that Moore and Miller, and this sort of self-awareness and maturity, I suppose, that Moore and Miller had brought to the superhero genre, but without perhaps some of that nuance. So in that, I mean, Watchmen, when collected as a bookstore-friendly trade paperback, is often described as one of the greatest graphic novels, if not the greatest novels of all time. I mean, its influence is still strongly felt in books like The Boys or Invincible or Kick-Ass, which take a slightly more subversive approach to the superhero genre. As superheroes began to seep into other media, movies and TV shows, it's not surprising that Watchmen was adapted as a movie and subsequently a TV show, because it comes at a point when the audience, be it a comic book reader or a movie-going public, have become familiar with the conventions of the genre and arguably tired of the conventions of the genre and are ready to see them parodied or satired. But Moore is not besotted with the superhero, much like many other British creators like Garth Ennis and so on, who kind of come and do superheroes because that's the bread and butter of American comic books, but he has wider interests. And once he had built that sort of cachet, that name recognition, he really used that name recognition to explore stories and subjects and genres that tended to fall outside what was obvious of the American comic book industry.
Moore discussed Watchmen in Comics Britannia, which was a BBC 4 documentary that aired in 2007.
It was so easy to have an effect because the majority of the writers and artists who come before us had never thought of challenging any of these assumptions regarding the superhero genre. They had thought that perhaps at best it might be a cynical joke about superheroes, but yes, there is that quality in stuff like Watchmen. There is that element of, wouldn't these characters be a joke if they were in the real world? But there's also a poignance to the characters. Wouldn't these characters be somehow kind of sad and touching in the real world? And there's no reason why we can't exploit all of these things. When you look at these familiar characters, with from a new perspective. You can suddenly see things that have actually been true about the characters right from their very inception in the late 30s. But nobody had applied a political interpretation to them or a sexual interpretation. Well, what Watchmen became was entirely a meditation about power. We were thinking about how each of these characters, to some degree, represented different sorts of power. We had the global situation unwinding and unfolding behind them, where you'd got different sorts of superpowers at odds with each other. An escalating situation in Afghanistan, and various other bits of bad world news that suggest that the nuclear doomsday clock is getting closer to the midnight mark. To some degree, if you're talking about superheroes, it's very likely to become a meditation upon power. You find that, yes, superheroes in the real world are kind of funny. They're also kind of scary, because actually a person dressing in a mask and going around beating up criminals is a vigilante psychopath. That's what Batman is, in essence. And we came up with the character of Rorschach as a way of exploring what that Batman-type driven, vengeance-fueled vigilante would be like in the real world. And the short answer is a nut. I mean, it wasn't until halfway through that we realised that Rorschach would not survive the book. It just became obvious. We realised that this was a character, if ever there was a character, who'd got a king-size death wish. He was in pain, psychological pain, every moment of his life, and he wanted out of it, but with honour, in whatever his own twisted standards of honour might have been.
The impact of Dave Gibbons and Alan Moore's work on Watchmen was testified to in the 2009 documentary, The Phenomenon, the comic that changed comics. Starring in the film was the Watchmen film producers Zack and Deborah Snyder, as well as Gerard Way of My Chemical Romance, who covered Bob Dylan's Desolation Row for the film's soundtrack.
It takes a look at itself, but it also gives you what it's about and examines that. Your privacy and your ability to have a normal relationship, your ability to have a normal job, all the things that we take for granted. They sacrifice that for justice or something like that. And what does that do to you? Does that make you crazy? Does it make you a recluse? Does it make you lose touch with humanity? These are all the questions that Watchmen asks. What is a good guy? Who are the good guys? What does that even mean? Who decides whose morality is correct, you know? Great sci-fi is able to deconstruct our world, you know, it holds up a mirror to us, you know, you see in that world the relevant messages of our own.
It really dismantles and really looks at that genre and turns it on its ear. And I think maybe that's why people like Rorschach so much, because he lives by his own code, and it's very black and white. There's good and there's evil, and evil must be punished. And I think the notion as an audience is that that's pretty good. These masked vigilantes, are they doing the right thing? Are they just as bad as the villains that they're trying to catch? I think that we all think, oh, wouldn't it be great for someone to take matters into their own hands, or, you know what, the court system takes too long and too many people get off, and really, like, someone should just go in there and crime bust. Abuse of power is a strong theme throughout Watchmen. Not just actually the superheroes, but I think it's even bigger than that, where we have a President Nixon at the time, because the superhero is American and basically the government controls him, he actually takes those powers and uses Dr. Manhattan to change term limits. So he gives himself more power. What does it do to religion? What does it do to politics? What does it do to just society having the super being live among us?
Like, it changed my entire life. Like, after reading that, I wanted to be a comic artist. It's the one graphic novel I tell people that don't read comics to read.
1988 saw the release of Batman, The Killing Joke.
The Killing Joke is that well-known Batman story in which we get a version of the Joker's origin, sometimes canonical, usually not. And it's also the story in which the Joker shoots Barbara Gordon, better known obviously as Batgirl, and paralyzes her. And that character for the better part of 3 decades after that storyline served as the wheelchair-bound Oracle. And so the story was originally kind of positioned as one of those Elseworld stories, as a story that was not necessarily canon. At least that seems to be how Moore describes it, but then seemed to become integrated into the canon, such that Batgirl was no longer in the books, and so on. It is a book that is heavily criticized today, and was controversial at its time for its depiction of the Joker, its depiction of Barbara Gordon as a victim of the Joker's violence. It is one of those, what's sometimes described as a more painterly book, in the sense that the art style. So Brian Boland as the artist, who's another one of those kind of British 80s creators who made the move to the US. And so the book was part of a wider trend of trying to bring maturity, I suppose, or perceived maturity to Batman, so that this is not Batman for kids. The book is quite mature in terms of its subject matter. But over time, the sort of fondness for that story, or it cannot really be sort of celebrated uncritically. And so the picture of the Joker, the picture of the crimes he inflicts upon Barbara Gordon in particular, prompt criticism. And it's not surprising that those who created the book would want to distance themselves from it, even while it was hugely influential on depictions of the Joker, particularly offering a version of the Joker's backstory that, when the Joker's origin is sort of elucidated, this is often the origin they go with as a failed stand-up comedian who became involved inadvertently almost in organized crime.
As divisive as Batman the Killing Joke was, it certainly had its fans, particularly Joker actor Mark Hamill and filmmaker Kevin Smith, as discussed in the 2005 documentary Legends of the Dark Knight, The History of Batman.
A Death in the Family was just one of the many landmark stories to come out of the 80s. Writers and artists were stretching themselves in bold new directions and diving headfirst into the dark corners of Batman's world in graphic novels such as Arkham Asylum and The Killing Joke, a new look at a classic tale.
I was a huge fan of The Killing Joke, which is a story that Alan Moore had written and Brian Boland had drawn. That kind of is more of a Joker story than a Batman story. But at the end, Batman kind of gets to laugh a little bit, which I was charmed by.
Killing Joke is, it's such a nice, straightforward story, but it's probably one of the most, in my mind, one of the most brilliant stories there's been told in mainstream superhero comics.
I wanted it to be very much about the Joker because he was, to me, such a fascinating character. Batman, if anything, is more of a shadowy. He almost works best when he's a two-dimensional character. To me, Joker is somehow a much more rounded character. He's an enigma completely because he is very much the way a lot of us, on some level, are. Well, it's well written. Alan does have the ability to take a lot of the characters and just know what people really would like. I mean, he's not pandering to commercial taste, but he knows what's good about the characters.
In 1982, the first issue of V for Vendetta was released. The book would not be completed until 1989.
So going back to his time in Britain, where he would have created like V for Vendetta, for Warrior, or From Hell, which is his Jack the Ripper story, he was pushing the comic book form into revisionist histories, and obviously 1984 influenced dystopias in the case of V for Vendetta that were critical or at least shaped by the time, writing primarily in the 1980s, the Cold War, Thatcher in the UK, Reagan in the States. And so, post Watchmen, he continues that approach.
I was attending a lot of the Rock Against Racism marches with the Anti-Nazi League. I knew a bit about the threat of fascism. So this struck me as potentially a very interesting backdrop for this future world that I was going to be talking about, because as with most of the future worlds in science fiction, you're not talking about the future. You're talking about the present. You are using the future as a way of giving a bit of room to move, a bit of a fantasy element. It makes it into something that is once removed from the thing that you're actually talking about, so people can enjoy it on a fantasy level, while hopefully perhaps some of the deeper points that you're making are sinking in. So we put V for Vendetta together on that basis. It was David Lloyd's idea and it was a brilliant idea, to actually make him look like Guy Fawkes. Which we'd been struggling with what this guy should actually look like, and we'd come up with several things that weren't very satisfactory. But when Dave suggested, almost as a joke, I don't think he expected me to go along with it, he suggested this sort of Guy Fawkes figure. And as soon as I saw it, I saw that this was genius. It was connecting to this whole British mythology. There was something so British and so striking about that iconic image, and it played well into the kind of thinking that was already starting to develop upon the strip. Anarchy is, and always has been, a romance. It is clearly the best way and the only morally sensible way to run the world. That everybody should be the master of their own destiny. Everybody should be their own leader. This is something that I still believe. I think that even a cursory look around the world at the moment, particularly at the moment, would reveal that it is about 0.00001% of the world's population that causes 99.99999% of the world's problems. And that tiny percentage, it's not the Jewish banking conspiracy. It's not the asylum seekers. It's not the secret homosexual conspiracy running Hollywood. It's not even the Scientologists. It is leaders. But what we need is an administration, at most. We don't need people to boss us about. I didn't want to just come into this as a self-confessed anarchist and say, right, here's this anarchist, here's the good guy, here's all these bad fascists, they're the bad guys. I mean, that's trivial and insulting to the reader. I wanted to present some of the fascists as being ordinary and, in some instances, even likeable human beings. They weren't just Nazi cartoons with monocles and University of Heidelberg dueling scars. They were people who had made their choices for a reason. Sometimes that reason was cowardice. Sometimes that reason was wanting to get on. Sometimes it was a genuine belief in those principles. So we suggest that, the Nazis, they weren't from space. They weren't from the depths of hell. They were butchers and street sweepers and school teachers and ordinary people from ordinary works of life. They weren't monsters, but they just went along with fascism when fascism was the order of the day. It was a very morally ambiguous and very morally complex strip, and in its original and in, I believe, its best inception, it was entirely in black and white. And Dave Lloyd was using this stark chiaroscuro style, where you'd got no bordering outlines on the characters. You'd got hard black up against hard white in the artwork. Whereas in the story, in the text, there was almost nothing but shades of grey. in moral terms. And that kind of contrast, I think, worked really well in the original strip. Anarchy wears two faces, both creator and destroyer. Thus, destroyers topple empires, make a canvas of clean rubble where creators can then build a better world. Rubble, once achieved, makes further ruins means irrelevant. Away with our explosives then. Away with our destroyers. They have no place within our better world. But let us raise a toast to all our bombers, all our bastards, most unlovely and most unforgivable. Let's drink their health, then meet with them no more.
In the 2000s, there were 4 separate film adaptations of Alan Moore books. The 2 most popular ones were V for Vendetta and Watchmen. Watchmen was adapted a second time in 2019 as a miniseries. It went on to win an astonishing 11 Emmy Awards.
But the idea of not putting his name on a big budget adaptation of his work, I think, is very in keeping with his anti-establishment sensibility, in the sense that, I mean, he probably came to comics at a time where it was still a grassroots underground culture, and no one could really have anticipated the transmedia success of these characters. And so the kind of the trappings, the Hollywood trappings that came with these characters moving into the 2000s would sort of chafe with his sensibilities. And so, not taking the his share of the profits, and the profits will be modest because comic book creators historically have been under sort of remunerated for their contribution to the characters, but like not taking that and not having the name recognition would be very much in keeping with his anti-establishment sensibilities.
Moore made his distaste for these Hollywood adaptations crystal clear in a discussion in 2012 at the Nottingham Contemporary.
I would query that the mistake you're making is that film storyboards are like comics. They're not. Film storyboards, they are, and anyway, film storyboards are a guide to the film, which is a completely different medium. There were things that I was doing in Watchmen which were, and in most of my comics books, they're designed not to be, they're designed to show off what the comics medium can do. They weren't designed to be films. And it's like when they came to do the V for Vendetta, or let's say the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen film, or the V for Vendetta film, or the From Hell film, which I believe was at least one of the better. I've not seen any of these because, as I've pointed out, I do prefer to criticise things from a position of complete ignorance. But they came up with a completely different story with the V for Vendetta film. There was a lot of the techniques which they couldn't reproduce, and they missed out all of the, I understand from people who have seen the film, they missed out all of the important kind of dialogue about violence and whether it's okay for someone to kill people just because they're the hero of a comic strip or movie. Why should somebody who's the title character, what, do they get a free pass? Whatever their behaviour is. We had quite a careful debate in that strip about, is it all right ever to use violence? And I think that we came down firmly on the side of no, it's not. But sometimes people do. And all of that was missed out. Also, it was done as a direct response to the Margaret Thatcher years. It was done when the National Front were gaining, that was, for younger listeners, the National Front was what we used to call like the British National Party or the English Defence League or whatever they're called now. They were on the rise, Margaret Thatcher was in office. We were specifically responding to that. Whereas the American people making the film, they don't care about all that. They wanted to make it into a parable for 9/11. And, you know, make it a bit contemporary and, in fact, sort of about what had happened in America. Now, during the Thatcher years, when I wanted to comment upon that, I did a story that was like set in Britain. If they wanted to do something about 9/11, couldn't they have come up with their own story? Yeah, I don't see, it might entertain people for a few minutes, but I'm not interested in it because it's not the story that I was trying to tell. And so therefore, if somebody's going, yeah, we're going to do a story that's got a few of your characters in, maybe, and some other characters that we've just thrown in because we felt like it, we've given it a different story because yours wouldn't really work for a movie audience, you know. In that case, why do it at all? Well, yeah, actually, I know why, because it's got the name of my work attached to it. And if I hadn't done an awful lot of struggling and cursing people in a very strict technical sense, I would have had to have had my name on the Watchmen film and the V for Vendetta film, and people would think, oh well, I've seen the film, I guess that was like the book. I'm really proud of my work. You know, I put a lot of attention and care into it.
And that is a wrap for this week's episode of The Real Heroes. Be sure to sign up to the show's Patreon for this week's bonus episode. It is the story of when legendary musician Michael Jackson attempted to buy Marvel Entertainment.